Hello and welcome back to Shakesyear. We are working on Thomas Lord Cromwell, and we get to hear from Cromwell today in Act 5, Scene 5, which is the final scene of the play, but we just finished up with Act 4 yesterday. And the important thing, because we're going to rush through these scenes that we need to cover, the important thing to remember is that by the end of Act 4, Garnier has gotten a couple of witnesses to swear that they overheard Cromwell say that he wanted to kill the king. So this is all, it's a setup, it's a fix, because there was a law that was passed that said that anybody who is found guilty of treason can be executed without a trial. So this is how they're going to get around the fact that the king still actually likes Cromwell. And as near as we can tell, and as near as the audience can tell, Cromwell has been awesome. He pays back his debts, he overpays back his debts, with more interest than anybody ever expected to get. So all of that comes together. We've got the Bishop of Winchester, Garnier, along with Norfolk and Suffolk, deciding that they are going to set Cromwell up, saying that he's a traitor to the crown so that they can have him executed. So Act 5, Scene 1, we are on a street in London, and we've got Bedford there. Remember, Bedford was in on this conversation about how they're going to set up Cromwell, and he's upset about the fact that he's afraid that Cromwell's end is very near. But then Cromwell and his train sort of flutter across the stage, and he's like, "Oh, hey, Bedford, sorry, it's good to see you, but I gotta go because the king has summoned me." So he leaves really quickly, and Bedford's like, he's running around so fast. And a second later, Cromwell and his train come back across the stage going the other way for another sort of drive-by, like, "Oh, hey, sorry, I gotta run. I have to go get the Privy Seal from Dorset and Lambeth because he's sick, but we'll talk soon." And then, he's off again. And Bedford is like, wow, it's like his life is so crazy. He's just running around all the time. But then a messenger comes in and says that Bedford has been summoned to Lambeth by the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk. And he's like, yes, I'll be able to talk to Cromwell there. I need to send him this letter in advance of everybody getting there. So he gives the messenger a letter to take to Cromwell. And he's like, all right, now I'm off to Lambeth. And that's the end of Act 5, Scene 1. Act 5, Scene 2, we're on a street near the Thames where Cromwell is about to get on the boat to go to Lambeth, and the messenger comes in to deliver the letter from Bedford, and he's like, Bedford said that you need to read this letter because it pertains specifically to you. And Cromwell's like, yes, I promise, I will read the letter, and he gives the messenger some money, and that's the end of Act 5, Scene 2. Nice and short. Act 5, Scene 3, we are in Lambeth now, sort of near the docks, and we've got the Bishop of Winchester, Garnier, we've got Suffolk, Norfolk, Bedford, some other official type persons hanging around, and the herald reads out a proclamation stating that Cromwell is a traitor to the crown, and the rest of them are like, amen, but Bedford's sort of like, oh, amen. He's still not happy about this whole thing. So Cromwell and his crew arrive on their boat, and he is immediately arrested for treason. So his crew start to draw their swords, but then Garnier's people are told that they are supposed to kill any of Cromwell's people who draw their swords, and Cromwell's like, everybody just put your swords away, nobody needs to kill anybody. Who accuses me of treason? And Garnier's like, oh, this is not the time and place to talk about that sort of thing. And Norfolk is like, you know what you did. We don't need to talk about it. And the king knows about the whole thing too. And Cromwell's like, yes, take me in front of the king, because the king knows that I am not a traitor to the crown. And what's interesting, I feel like we've had very similar conversations like these in other plays that we've been looking at recently. But also, Cromwell is saying all of this in rhyming couplets, which is a sort of fascinating commentary on his state of mind as he is being arrested for treason. Because also he's the one that wrote the law that said that if someone is found guilty of treason, they can be executed without a trial. So he knows exactly what's at stake here if he is actually accused and found guilty of treason. So he's like, yes, take me in front of the king. And they're like, well, actually, no, you're going to be taken to the Tower until that can happen. So get back on your boat. You have to be taken back to London so you can be imprisoned in the Tower. He's like, let me talk to my men along the way. They're like, well, yeah, you can talk to them on the boat. That's fine. So he is taken out. One of the officers, official people, takes him back to his boat so that he can go back to the Tower of London. But on his exit, he turns to Norfolk and he's like, just watch your back because you're going to be next. So as soon as he's gone, Gardenier turns to Norfolk and he's like, oh, he doesn't know what he was talking about. He's talking crazy because he's so upset about this whole thing. And then he turns to Bedford and he's like, why are you crying for a traitor? And Bedford is like, this is all just happening so fast. It doesn't make any sense. And that's basically the end of the scene. So a very quick trip to Lambeth for a nice little arrest on a boat pier. So Act 5, Scene 4, we are on a street in London and we get to hear a conversation between these two citizens, and they are shocked by the fact that Cromwell has been arrested for treason. They say it doesn't make any sense, and he's done all these charitable things. How is it possible that he's a traitor? How could, what on earth happened here? They don't get it, they're not behind it. But the first citizen does point out that sort of the higher somebody goes in the governmental structure, the more enemies they make along the way. And not necessarily for doing bad things. It could just be that people are jealous and wish that they had gotten promoted instead. So sort of the higher you go in government, the greater the risk of some terrible fall like this that's happening to Cromwell right now could happen. So it doesn't advance a lot of plot, but a little bit of interesting commentary and just an interesting view that the people in London may not have been totally behind the execution of Cromwell for treason. So anyway, they part ways. One of them goes to the court to try to watch the proceedings. The other one goes into the city. They want to see who can figure out, who can get the best news about the things. And that's the end of Act 5, Scene 4. Whew, so now we've made it to Act 5, Scene 5, the final act of the play. And we start out, we are in a room in the Tower of London, and Cromwell is there by himself. And he says, now, Cromwell, hast thou time to meditate and think upon thy state and of the time. Thy honors came unsought, aye, and unlooked for. Thy fall as sudden and unlooked for too. What glory was in England that I had not? Who in this land commanded more than Cromwell? Except the king, who greater than myself? But now I see what after ages shall, the greater men, more sudden is their fall. And now I do remember the Earl of Bedford was very desirous for to speak to me, and afterwards sent to me a letter, the which I think I still have in my pocket. Now may I read it, for I now have leisure. And this, I take it is. My lord, come not this night to Lambeth, for if you do, your state is overthrown, and much I doubt your life. And if you come, then if you love yourself, stay where you are. Oh God. Had I but read this letter, then had I been free from the lion's paw. Deferring this to read until tomorrow, I spurned at joy and did embrace my sorrow. Now, Master Lieutenant, when's this day of death? I'm sorry, this is heartbreaking for me. This speech reminds me very much of Richard II's monologue when he is imprisoned at the end. You know, I wasted time and now time doth waste me. It's not quite as eloquent and not quite as grand, but it does have that, you know, I did all these wonderful things and now I have a minute to sit and think about it. And I guess what's occurring to me as I think about it is the dangers of getting too high in the government. You know, the higher you climb, the harder and faster you fall. But then he remembers that Bedford had sent him a letter, that Bedford had wanted to talk to him in that scene where he just kept running across the stage. He remembers that Bedford had given him the letter and he never read it. So he opens and reads this letter, and the letter says, don't come to Lambeth because you're going to get arrested and maybe executed. So the fact that he waited to read this letter is what undid him. And he knows that 100%. He knows that this was his bad for not reading it. Had he read it, he could have avoided all of this. But the other thing that he gets out of it is that Bedford really was his true friend. Bedford tried to warn him that bad things were coming. So at least he knows that Bedford was his friend. But, how devastating to find yourself on death row and to just know that if you had read this letter a couple hours before, you wouldn't be in that position. You would still be out free in the world doing all of the things that you normally do. So, it's just heartbreaking. So anyway, at the very end, the lieutenant comes in and he says, Lieutenant, when am I supposed to die? And the lieutenant is like, I wish that you didn't have to at all. But Bedford, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Garnier are all here to see you. So they all come in. And Cromwell is like, does the king know about my state? Does he know about my situation? What's going on? And Garnier says that the king is so upset by Cromwell's treason that he refuses to see him, which kind of sets Cromwell off. He gets to rail for a minute about, he's like, wasn't it just yesterday that we were besties? Like just yesterday he was listening to me and we were planning things for the future and he trusted me and all of this. And a little bit of that, the higher they climb, the harder they fall sort of thing. But then he turns to Garnier, the bishop, and he's like, will you take a letter to the king for me? And the bishop is like, no, I'm not going to deliver a traitor's letters anywhere. He's like, okay, well, will you give him a message by word then? If I give you a message, will you give it to the king? And he's like, yeah, okay, fine, I'll do that. So he's like, okay, everybody, this is the message that I'm giving to Garnier that he's supposed to give to the king. I want him to tell the king that when the king takes a look around at the faith and loyalty of everybody around him, he will find that Garnier is the faintest-hearted man in England. And Bedford is like, calm down just a little bit. That's maybe too much. And Cromwell's like, okay, yeah, maybe that was a lot. But by the same token, he's the one that's doing this to me. This is his vendetta against me. And I am condemned to die now because of him. So I'm allowed to say some stuff. And he turns to Sadler, another one of the just sort of gentlemen that's there. And he's like, will you deliver a letter to the king for me? And Sadler's like, yes, I will. So he scribbles down a letter and he gives it to Sadler. And Sadler quickly leaves to go deliver the letter. And Garnier is like, okay, well, we have this warrant for your death. It's right here. Like, it's time to get on with it. Can we just sort of get a move on here? And Cromwell is going to have a monologue about that we will hear tomorrow. So, whew. Thanks for hanging in there for all that stuff. We're almost done, just 2 more monologues to go. So I'll see you tomorrow for more. Mwah.